Huxley's Brave New World, alongside George Orwell's 1984, are certainly the two most famous depictions of dystopian futures ever written. Both novels were written in the 20th century, with Brave New World being published in 1932 and 1984 being published in 1949. However, I feel like 1984 typically is a novel that gets more frequently discussed and talked about. It's a nightmarish depiction of a repressive totalitarian surveillance regime. It's something that was embodied in the regimes of the 20th century, like Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And of course, the revelations in 2013 about NSA surveillance here in the United States raised fears that Big Brother was indeed already watching us. I'm guessing that even if you haven't read 1984, you know what Big Brother is, you know what the world of 1984 is like, but you probably don't know what the world state in Brave New World is. But though I think there are some really great and compelling aspects of 1984, especially around the concepts of language, truth, and doublespeak, I find Brave New World more fascinating, troubling, and reminiscent of the world we live in today in the 21st century. It's a world governed not so much by fear of a repressive and violent government. Instead, it's a world where the citizens are blinded and satiated by the fulfillment of their desires. They aren't in servitude due to fear and intimidation. They're in servitude because they like it. Brave New World's dystopian vision poses the question whether happiness or pursuit of pleasure should be our highest value in life. If you think happiness is the highest value, the goal of our existence, then buckle up, because Huxley is going to provide compelling justifications for why the world state in Brave New World would be the ideal way to maximize that value of happiness, even if it makes you feel uncomfortable at first. Now, since this novel is speculative and science fiction, we do not need to dwell too much on the historical context, but one other aspect of Brave New World that I find fascinating is definitely its publication date, 1932. Orwell's novel, 1984, like I already mentioned, was published after World War II, in the year 1949. And at that point in history, right after World War II, it of course makes sense why an author like Orwell would imagine a future of violent and repressive surveillance regimes. But Brave New World seems eerily prophetic in its ability to imagine a dystopian future that feels familiar to our own in many ways, and it was published before World War II, before we saw the worst of those totalitarian regimes. Huxley actually wrote a letter to George Orwell after Orwell published 1984, letting him know his thoughts on the novel. And while he loved the novel, Huxley was skeptical that Orwell's vision of the future was accurate. He found the repressive mechanisms in 1984 far too cumbersome and laborious to actually be the path for governments in the future. And let's listen to this letter, or two quotes from it. So Huxley writes, "My own belief is that the ruling oligarchy will find less arduous and wasteful ways of governing and of satisfying its lust for power, and these ways will resemble those which I have described in Brave New World." Okay. If you're an author writing to another author, here's a tip. Don't write to them saying, "Hey, great novel, but I think my depictions were way better than yours." All jokes aside, though, here's another great line from that letter that I think gets at this same idea. Huxley writes, "Within the next generation, I believe that the world's rulers will discover that conditioning and narco-hypnosis are more efficient as instruments of government than clubs and prisons, and that the lust for power can be just as completely satisfied by suggesting people into loving their servitude as by flogging and kicking them into obedience." So think about our own life here in the 21st century. Couldn't there be a compelling argument that all the consumerism, tech, social media, streaming platforms, video games, pharmaceutical and recreational drugs are the types of instruments of control that Huxley was concerned about? What seems to speak more to our experience, or which seems to speak more to our experience in the 21st century? Living in fear that a repressive government will kick in our doors and throw us into secret prisons for whispering words of dissent against them? Or simply numbing and distracting ourselves in a solipsistic pursuit of pleasure? Regardless of whether you agree with me and Huxley about whether his vision of the future was more accurate than Orwell's, I'm excited to break down and analyze the novel. Roughly, there are going to be three aspects of the novel that we'll be unpacking, which are thankfully in chronological order. First, understanding exactly what the world state is, how it conditions its citizens, why it came into being. Second, we'll look at the major characters and their conflicts that propel the plot of the novel. And then third, we'll do a very close analysis of the final philosophical debate between Mustafa Mond and John the Savage as a way to question our own fundamental values about what we think gives life meaning. So with that, before we move to the first part, an analysis of chapter 1, and we start to analyze the world state, I want to take a look at the epigraph. And so let's take a look here at this quote that is in French in the novel, but I have translated it here to English. So it says, "Utopias seem to be much more achievable than we formerly believed them to be. Now we find ourselves presented with another alarming question. How do we prevent utopias from coming into existence? Utopias are possible. Life tends towards the formation of utopias. Perhaps a new century will begin, a century in which intellectuals and the privileged will dream of ways to eliminate utopias and return to a non-utopic society, less perfect and more free." So this quote is certainly playing on the conventional idea that utopias are actually impossible to achieve. They are fantasies. They are things completely detached from reality. The etymology of utopia, it was written in a novel published in 1516 by Sir Thomas More, and it's a Greek word, or it's combining two Greek words, eu, which means not or no, and topos, which means place. So literally, the etymology of utopia means no place or nowhere. And of course, Sir Thomas More was playing with the idea that trying to create a perfect society would be one completely detached from reality. But with this thinker, Nicholas Berdyaev, who was a Russian intellectual at the end of the 19th century into the early 20th century, who started off as a proponent of communism, but ended up turning away from it and having to flee Russia after the Russian Revolution. And he spent the rest of his life in France. So you can imagine he was probably skeptical about these utopian projects that he saw occurring in his own country of Russia with the communist revolution. But he's absolutely taking the opposite approach of Sir Thomas More and saying, actually, utopias in the 20th century, perhaps the danger of dangers, is that they are more achievable than we thought that they were. And perhaps our quest to try to perfect society and to create a utopian society is something that is incredibly dangerous. So like all epigraphs, this gives us a good sense or clue of what the main themes of the novel are going to be, or what the author's ultimate attitude is going to be. And so we get right from the start, we know Huxley isn't going to be a fan of the world state. I still think that we can't just immediately say the world state is bad. What I really like about this novel is it's not just mustache-twirling villains doing evil things just for the sake of being evil. Huxley actually really provides a lot of robust and good justifications for why the world state makes sense and why it might be a good idea. Mustafa Mond and the other directors that we see who justify why the world state exists don't just do it out of a sense of evil or out of a pure grab for power. They actually are doing it in the name of the ultimate good of the entire community and all the citizens. So we're going to have to grapple with these questions and decide for ourselves whether or not we ultimately think the world state is a good form of civilization, or whether or not it is problematic and why. So with that, let's start with chapter 1. Looking, and these next couple lectures are going to really be looking at the world state itself and trying to just unpack what it is, how it works, how it develops its citizens, and its justifications for why it came into existence in the first place. And so the first part of this, today, we're going to be looking at chapter 1, where we see how the world state physically develops or biologically develops humans within this civilization. So let's jump in. We're going to start with the very opening page of this novel. That's page 3 in my edition. And we're just going to start reading and see what we can notice here. I think Huxley does a great job in these opening paragraphs of packing in a bunch of clues about the world state before we've really learned explicitly exactly what's going on. The opening sentence says, "A squat gray building of only 34 stories." Now, it's really easy to just rush past this sentence, not think anything important happened there. But if we do some figurative analysis and think more critically about the words being used here, we learn a whole bunch about this world right off the bat. First, the color gray. Gray is always associated with a sense of lifelessness. It's a droll color, so we get the sense this isn't a colorful or life-giving society right off the bat. And second, I think that word only 34 stories is really telling about the type of society we're living in. 34 stories is huge, and so if this building is described as being only 34 stories, we get the sense that this is a highly advanced and industrialized civilization. Over the main entrance, the words Central London Hatchery and Conditioning Center, and in a shield, the World State's motto, Community, Identity, Stability. So these values, community, identity, stability, it makes sense how community and stability could go hand in hand. If you have everybody with a strong sense of community, it could help to create a sense of cohesion and stability within a civilization. Now, typically, we think of identity actually as cutting against or being opposed to community. We think of identity as being unique to ourselves, as being opposed to the values of community. So how is identity one of the three values? How are these things not exclusive or undermining each other? Obviously, the world state's definition of identity is going to be very different than our own. Let's keep reading, and I think this paragraph is really great as it's describing this fertility center. Pay particular attention to the word choice that Huxley uses within this paragraph to get a sense for how he feels about this. The enormous room on the ground floor faced towards the north. Cold for all the summer beyond the panes, for all the tropical heat of the room itself. A harsh, thin light glared through the windows, hungrily seeking some draped lay figure, some pallid shape of academic goose flesh, but finding only the glass and nickel and bleakly shining porcelain of a laboratory. Winteriness responded to winteriness. The overalls of the workers were white, their hands gloved with a pale corpse-colored rubber. The light was frozen, dead, a ghost. Only from the yellow barrels of the microscopes did it borrow a certain rich and living substance, lying along the polished tubes like butter, streak after luscious streak in long recession down the work tables. And this, said the director, opening the door, is the fertilizing room. So think to yourself, what word choice did you notice within this paragraph? Hopefully you picked up on a whole pattern of words that all get at the same figurative ideas. Cold, pallid, winteriness, white, corpse-colored, frozen, dead, pale, ghost. All of these words evoke a sense of lifelessness. And of course, there's something inhuman about this, but there is a sense of irony here because this is a fertilizing room. This is a place where life is being created, and yet it's being described by Huxley here as being very lifeless and inhuman. So you can sense the irony that is being developed in this passage through the tension between the diction choices that Huxley has and the location that we're in, a fertility center. Let's keep reading. Bent over their instruments, 300 fertilizers were plunged as the director of hatcheries and conditioning entered the room. In the scarcely breathing silence, the absent-minded soliloquizing hum or whistle of absorbed concentration. A troop of newly arrived students, very young, pink, and callow, followed nervously, rather abjectly, at the director's heels. Each of them carried a notebook in which, whenever the great man spoke, he desperately scribbled, straight from the horse's mouth. It was a rare privilege. So notice the attitude of the students as they're listening to this director of hatcheries and conditioning speak and talk about the world state. They're scribbling every word furiously. Again, that gives us clues about this society. As a teacher, I wish my students scribbled every word I said as furiously as these students. But obviously, you get the sense here that these students aren't critically thinking about what the director is saying. They're not deciding for themselves whether or not they agree or disagree with his statements. There's a sense of blind obedience to whatever the authority figures within this world have to say. And I think this next paragraph does a really good job of giving us a big idea in terms of what the values of the world state are. So the director begins speaking. He says, "Just to give you a general idea," he would explain to them. Or, of course, some sort of general idea they must have if they were to do their work intelligently, though as little of one if they were to be good and happy members of society as possible. For particulars, as everybody knows, make for virtue and happiness. Generalities are intellectually necessary evils. Not philosophers, but fret sawyers and stamp collectors compose the backbone of society. So let's try to break this down, this generalities versus particularities, or philosophers versus stamp collectors. Notice this civilization, the world state, does not want its students, or does not want people thinking about higher ideas or the generalities about what are the structures of this civilization, how does it work, what are the power dynamics, what is going on within the world, what is my place within the world. They don't want people asking those big philosophical questions. Instead, in order to maximize good and happy members of society, they want them to have some generalities, just as little as possible, the intellectually necessary evils, but they really want them focused on small, minute tasks, the particulars. And I think stamp collector is a really good symbol of that. What is a stamp collector? It's someone who's really obsessed with these small details that are ultimately inconsequential in the grand scheme of things, but allow them to spend their time on frivolous distractions. So you get the sense of the importance of ignorance to happiness and stability within the world state. They don't want people asking big questions like philosophers or questioning their place within the universe. They just want them distracted by trivial matters like collecting stamps. Let's now move to the Bokanovsky process, where we'll learn a little bit about how humans are actually produced. And this is described from pages 5 to 7. I'm actually going to read a passage on page 6, where the director begins to explain exactly what Bokanovsky's process is and how it works. So he says, Bokanovsky's process, repeated the director, and the students underlined the words in the little notebook. 1 egg, 1 embryo, 1 adult, normality. But a Bokanovskified egg will bud, will proliferate, will divide from 8 to 96 buds, and every bud will grow into a perfectly formed embryo, and every embryo into a full-size adult, making 96 human beings grow where only one grew before. Progress. So how does this process work? It's fairly straightforward. Rather than have humans be born through the biologically natural ways of a female getting pregnant and then giving birth, instead, they're able to manufacture and mass produce them. They manufacture them in laboratories. They get 1 egg or 1 embryo, and then they start dividing it, i.e. creating twins. But they've been able to manufacture it in a way where they can basically create 96 perfectly identical twins to maximize the efficiency of this. Another element of this passage that I would direct your attention to is that final word, progress. Progress is always a word that carries substantial value judgment with it. If you say this is progress, you are saying that thing is good. So what is progress being equated with within this world is scientific efficiency, being able to mass produce humans as efficiently as possible. So you're seeing the impact of industrialization and those elements emerging in the 20th century on Huxley's writing. We learn more on page 7 about why the world state is so insistent on producing humans in this way. It's not just about increasing the population. They view it as a crucial tactic of social stability. So halfway down the page on page 7, the director says, "My good boy," the director wheeled sharply round on him. "Can't you see? Can't you see?" He raised a hand. His expression was solemn. Bokanovsky's process is one of the major instruments of social stability. So you should be asking yourself, why is producing 96 identical twins, undermining their individuality, a major instrument of social stability? I think we get some explanation in these subsequent paragraphs. Standard men and women in uniform batches, the whole of a small factory staffed with the products of a single Bokanovskified egg. 96 identical twins working 96 identical machines. The voice was almost tremulous with enthusiasm. "You really know where you are, for the first time in history." He quoted the planetary motto, community, identity, stability. Grand words. If we could Bokanovskify indefinitely, the whole problem would be solved. Solved by standard gammas, unvarying deltas, uniform epsilons, millions of identical twins. The principle of mass production at last applied to biology. So I think in those final paragraphs, we get a sense of why producing humans in this way is good for social cohesion. It minimizes differences between individuals within the society. Notice the goal is to produce standard gammas, unvarying deltas, uniform epsilons. And we know that these are the various social classes of this civilization. So imagine if you're a gamma, let's say, and there are no differences between you and any other gammas. You all are identical twins, more or less. You have nothing to be jealous of. You have no differences to make you feel inferior or superior to others around you. It's not like today where, for instance, in class, you might feel a sense of inferiority because another student seems just more intelligent than you. You wouldn't feel a sense of inferiority because somebody else in the class, maybe you want to play basketball, is a foot taller than you and a lot faster than you and stronger than you. If you minimize those differences, according to the world state, you can improve social cohesion and stability because those differences won't produce conflict in the way that they probably do within our own world. So when the world state says identity is one of its core values, it's a little bit ironic from our attitude because it's not identity in terms of unique or special traits. It's identity in terms of every single person being exactly the same. Its identity is being identical to everybody else. So if we keep going on, this process is described across a couple more pages, but there's another interesting passage on page 13 where I think we get, again, some choice diction or choice, particular word choice from Huxley himself that he attributes to this process. So that big middle paragraph says, "For of course," said Mr. Foster, page 13, "in the vast majority of cases, fertility is merely a nuisance. One fertile ovary in 1200, that would really be quite sufficient for our purposes." So what Mr. Foster is describing here is the fact that they make it so that most people within the world state aren't actually fertile. They couldn't reproduce even if they wanted to. That would be an inefficiency. All they need, right, is a couple of embryos or eggs across, 1,200 people, because that gives them the eggs necessary to be able to reproduce humans in factories. They can't make everybody infertile, but the vast majority of people don't need to have fertility. But we want to have a good choice, he says. And of course, one must always have an enormous margin of safety. So we allow as many as 30% of the female embryos to develop normally. The others get a dose of male sex hormone every 24 meters for the rest of the course. Result, they're decanted as free martins, structurally quite normal, except he had to admit that they do have the slightest tendency to grow beards, but sterile. Guaranteed sterile. Which brings us at last, continued Mr. Foster, out of the realm of mere slavish imitation of nature into the much more interesting world of human invention. So this is interesting. We get what he's saying, right? We no longer just have to reproduce given the biological natural path of pregnancy to reproduction. Instead, what we can do now is we're in the world of human invention where we can force most humans to be sterile or infertile, and then we can mass manufacture humans in laboratories here. Now, if we think about the figurative associations with the word sterile, again, think about it. And you'll realize very quickly, if I were to call somebody sterile or a society sterile, it carries negative associations, and it carries those exact same associations with the word choice we saw on the first page of the novel. There's a sense of decay or withering, or more importantly, probably death and lifelessness. Because what is sterility or being sterile? It is an incapacity to produce. So infertility or being sterile, these words carry this figurative weight with them. And so I think absolutely, while this society is affirming this, I think Huxley is subtly implanting these deeper connotations into the brain of the reader so that we start to realize that there seems to be something wrong here. So that's the Bokanovsky process. Now let's look at the social predestination process, which again starts on page 13, actually just one paragraph down from where we were reading. It says, we also predestine and condition. We decant our babies as socialized human beings, as alphas or epsilons, as future sewage workers or future, he was going to say future world controllers, but correcting himself said future directors of hatcheries instead. So, okay, how does this work? He's saying that as they are manufacturing these humans, they're able to predestine their social location in life. How does that work? How can you predestine what class somebody will be in society or what job they're going to work? Well, I think we get more of an explanation of this on page 14. It says, reducing the number of revolutions per minute, Mr. Foster explained, the surrogate goes round slower, therefore passes through the lung at longer intervals, therefore gives the embryo less oxygen. Nothing like oxygen shortage for keeping an embryo below par. Again, he rubbed his hands. But why do you want to keep the embryo below par? Asked an ingenious student. Ass, said the director, breaking a long silence. Hasn't it occurred to you that an epsilon embryo must have an epsilon environment as well as an epsilon heredity? It evidently hadn't occurred to him. He was covered with confusion. The lower the caste, said Mr. Foster, the shorter the oxygen. The first organ affected was the brain. So, okay, you can see as they're decanting babies, as they're producing them in these vats, they condition them as different social classes by affecting things like oxygen levels. And so that determines, this is a sense of biological determinism, how intelligent they'll be or how capable they will be or what their physical attributes will be. So the key point here is that they can quite literally engineer differences into different social classes based on their environment, which will affect their heredity. It will affect their biological makeup. I'm guessing this makes us feel very, very deeply uncomfortable in the Western world in 2021. But let's keep reading and get a sense for why they are doing this. On page 16, heat conditioning, said Mr. Foster. So, okay, let's figure out what this heat conditioning is. Hot tunnels alternated with cool tunnels. Coolness was wedded to discomfort in the form of hard X-rays. By the time they were decanted, the embryos had a horror of cold. They were predestined to immigrate to the tropics, to be miners and acetate silk spinners and steel workers. Later on, their minds would be made to endorse the judgment of their bodies. We condition them to thrive on heat, concluded Mr. Foster. Our colleagues upstairs will teach them to love it. So, all right, these embryos that are going to develop to become workers in tropical, so hot and humid regions, they are doing heat conditioning to make it so that those embryos love and feel at home in hot, humid places, and they are being made to hate extreme cold. So that makes it so that biologically they will feel most comfortable in tropical hot places. And so this is, again, a form of predestination to help them inevitably love the job or their social location within society. And that, put the director sententiously, that is the secret of happiness and virtue, liking what you've got to do. All conditioning aims at that, making people like their unescapable social destiny. So, okay, this makes sense, right? If I were to ask everybody who wants to grow up to be a sewage worker, I'm guessing very few people will raise their hand, even though that's a really important job that needs to get done within society. We need people managing the sewage system, otherwise society, civilization won't work. But how many people, grow up really wanting to be a sewage worker? Probably not many. Somebody's going to have to do it. Now, what if I could condition the people who are going to have to be sewage workers to feel most comfortable within that environment, to make it so that they actually feel happiest and most at home when they are doing sewage work? If I could condition them biologically so that that would actually bring them the greatest sense of happiness, wouldn't there be something perhaps good in that, to get rid of all these choices that we have to make about what's my job going to be, what's my career going to be, or getting rid of maybe senses of inferiority that people who have to work jobs like sewage systems might feel because they're not doctors or lawyers? Wouldn't there be something good in that, perhaps? And that's certainly what the world state will say, and it's something that we're going to have to grapple with and debate. But this brings us to a very good place, the end of chapter 1, in terms of just understanding biologically how they are developing the physical traits of humans within the world state. Next time, we're going to take a look at chapter 2 and see psychologically how humans are being developed. So this is still part of this overall first section, first part of this lecture series, where we're going to be looking just at what the world state is. But hopefully we get a good sense of how the world state is controlling and predestining one's social location within this society, and mass manufacturing humans to undermine any sort of differences between them within particular social classes.